Stick, of course, with our focus this morning, taking a look at the stats to get a picture of the hijacking situation in this country. So hijackings or carjackings increased by 14%. This between April to June this year compared with the same period last year. Now, there were a total of 720 more carjackings that, of course, we've been informed about that we need to be aware of. That number, of course, expected to rise. But also take a look at some of the hotspots for hijackings. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Gauteng has the highest number of hijackings compared to other provinces. That's, though, followed by the Western Cape and KwaZulu-Natal. Mpumalanga, though, is the only province where hijackings actually decreased. But if we look at the 3 months this past year alone, the highest number of carjackings were actually recorded in May of this year. Now, also, if we consider the 10 police stations that recorded the most hijackings, take a look at this. 6 are in Gauteng as well. However, the province doesn't sit at the top of that list. Nyanga, Philippi East and Harare in the Western Cape are numbers 1, 2 and 3. Pinetown and KZN is the only other province in the top 10, this apart from Gauteng and the Western Cape. Moroka in Gauteng, though, has the biggest change, a nearly 80% increase in carjackings. But take a look at Kempton Park. Well, that area is the sole station that recorded a decrease. Yeah, we're focusing on this, and a car we know is stolen every 22 minutes, as Gareth mentioned earlier on. This in South Africa. The latest crime stats show that hijackings and carjackings in the country are only accelerating. But in fact, there was a 14% increase in the 3 months from April to June. This compared to the same period back in 2021. So a total of 5,866 hijackings were reported across the country in those 3 months this year alone. So let's delve further into this. We're now here of course, joined by G-Dog Gareth Edwards at the intersection of Jan Smuts and William Nicole Drive. G, that's the hot spot where you mentioned that it could get a bit messy because of the different intersections. I can imagine only if traffic lights aren't working how bad it looks there. But what can you tell us from where you stand?
Yeah, good morning. Welcome once again, everyone, to corner of William Nicol and Jan Smuts. This is just one of many hotspot intersections around the country. Now, I'm keeping a close eye on the time because, according to stats, here is the sound. Let's play the sound. Okay, that is the sound that you're going to hear every 22 minutes. On the show. There it is again for you throughout the show this morning. Every 22 minutes is significant because according to the latest stats of over 5,800 car hijackings this year, it works out to a vehicle and a family and a person being hijacked every 22 minutes. So that was the first one at 22 minutes after 6. We're going to continue doing that just to try and raise some awareness as to how often this happens. Because I think many of us, in terms of we go about our day, and unless we are directly affected by something like a hijacking, most people don't pay attention to it. So that sound will again be airing in 22 minutes. But just to answer your question before I go to my interview, you asked earlier, or you mentioned earlier, that there's certain vehicles that are the kind of vehicles that get hijacked more often than not. These are the most often targeted vehicles in South Africa. The stats I have is from security company Fidelity, their recent data. So the most hijacked vehicle in South Africa is a Toyota Hilux, the Bucky Toyota Hilux. Then is a Volkswagen Polo, the Toyota Quantum, which we know is often used for taxis and public transport, and a Nissan NP200. Now, that's not quite it is a Bucky, but it's a much smaller Bucky, more like a utility vehicle. So first and most often targeted vehicle, is a Toyota Hilux, Volkswagen Polo, Toyota Quantum, and the Nissan NP200 as well. You can imagine that has all kinds of knock-on effects for insurance as well. That's just to answer what we were talking about earlier with the vehicles. What kind of vehicles are the most hijacked? But let's bring in some experts who have done the research on this. They've got the numbers, they've got the stats, they've got the data. It's always a pleasure to welcome Dr. Stephen Gordon from the HSRC joining me this morning. Dr. Stephen and Dr. Gordon, good morning to you. I appreciate your time in joining us. Just take us through some of the research that you have found with car hijackings in South Africa. I don't imagine it paints a pretty picture. Good morning.
Oh, good morning, and thank you very much for speaking on this important issue. The Human Science Research Council, in which I work, conducts a large public opinion study, the South African Social Attitudes Survey. Now, this large public opinion study looks at public attitudes towards crime over a long period. And as you will correctly point out, the picture is rather dire. As your reporting has indicated, carjacking, as well as other serious crime, such as murder, attempted murder, and residential robbery, are at their worst level seen in the past 5 years. Now, if we look at how this translates and affects the adult population, we can see some varying worrying indicators. For example, about half of the adult population in South Africa said that worry about violent crime has had a negative impact on their quality of life. Moreover, we see falling and declining levels of trust in the South African police services. Consider that only 27% of the adult population of South Africa said they trusted the SAPS in 2021. 47% of South African adults stated that it was pointless to hand over criminal suspects to the police because they would not bring the offender to justice. In addition, we can see low levels of satisfaction with the way the government was handling the cutting of crime in people's neighborhoods. In 2021, only 24% of the adult public said that they were satisfied with the way government was handling the problem of crime in their neighborhood. So this indicates that the general population in South Africa is deeply worried about crime, feel personally unsafe, often in their own neighborhood, and feel that the police is not doing enough to fundamentally address the serious issue of crime in our country.
And this is exactly why I was hoping to speak to you, Doc, as well, because what you're highlighting really is incredibly high levels of anxiety and mistrust in the police, and how then does a criminal element that probably has access to these stats, they know they're probably not going to get reported to the police. They know that most people aren't going to bother even reporting the incidents as well. Would you attribute that to the spike in hijackings we're seeing, that once again we're seeing very clever criminal elements simply capitalizing on the fact that our police are ineffective? Would that be a fair statement in your mind?
One of the fundamental issues when you see low trust in the police, you see a rise of pro-vigilante sentiment, people who feel they can take the law into their own hands. This can be very concerning because, as you indicate, people are far less likely to report matters to the police and far more likely to try and take often quite violent actions to restore what they perceive to be justice within their community and within their society. This type of non-state violence is very disruptive to a community and far outside the kind of legal mechanisms and arrangements we'd like to see in the handling of crime. But it's important to understand why people show such high levels of distrust in the police services. People feel that the police services are not only ineffective at fundamentally addressing crime, they feel the police services are very unfair and inequitable in how laws are enforced. They feel that some groups, particularly the wealthy, are spared the hand of the law, and that poor, vulnerable people are targeted by police. Indeed, there is a perception that the police themselves are involved in criminal activity.
And that's exactly, Dr. Gordon, what I'm going to be speaking to Yusuf Abramji about a little bit later. And I love the fact that you've brought to the conversation and into focus is our mistrust as a country in the police and how it's now reflecting on this increase in hijackings. Dr. Stephen Gordon, I'm going to say thank you very much to you for joining us this morning. Dr. Stephen Gordon from the HSRC joining us this morning here on ENCA. It's our ongoing focus throughout the morning here on the channel about the increase in hijackings, not since before before COVID-19 have we seen hijackings at the level that they are now. Just to remind you, if you've just tuned in, I'm standing on the corner of William Nicol and Jan Smuts. It is one of the hijacking and smash and grab hotspots in the city of Sandton. We're going to be talking to Yusuf Abramji about this a little bit later as well. We've seen a 14% increase year on year between May and June of last year and May of June of this year. So what exactly is going on? The HRC's Dr. Gordon painting a very good picture, just setting the context, setting the framework for us to build on that conversation a little bit later. Tumza, as I come back to you as well, we are going to keep a very close eye on what's happening at William Nicol and Jan Smuts. Right now, traffic-wise, not much happening, but I'm sure you'll see a little bit later. Because, as I mentioned, the sequence of robots, you've got to look at each intersection specifically and try and understand the nature of the intersection. Why is it worse in some areas and not in others? I mean, just down the road here on William Nicol, we have another big intersection that's not considered a hotspot because it has more exit areas. Traffic is more flowing, whereas here, once the traffic starts building up, you've got one robot just behind us, maybe less than 50 meters. Then you've got this robot. Then you've got another robot about 100 meters after that as well. So you've got to understand why certain intersections are hotspots. And maybe that is where you were talking about earlier, Tumza, as I come back to you. Certain intersections might require better policing. But now I hear you say, who's going to do the policing, and do we trust the police to actually do the policing? Welcome to the issue of hijacking on ENCA. We are going to unpack it throughout this morning. And also just a reminder, every 22 minutes, you are going to hear the sound, it sounds to me like the sounds of sirens going off in the background, regardless of what is on air, every 22 minutes. That's important. When you hear that a little later this morning, you're going to know that that means another vehicle has been hijacked, another person has been attacked, another person and their family has been traumatized. So every 22 minutes, we'll have that sound here on ENCA. Tumza, back to you.